This is collaborative work with Clark Bernier, who's a doctoral candidate at Princeton, Charles Heckscher, who's an organizations scholar at Rutgers, and David Mimno, who's right there. And I'm going to talk, this talk really has two halves. I'm going to talk about two cases, one of which is finished and included all three of these guys, and the second of which is more aspirational. It's my future of social science. It's, like in the next year or so. And for which Charles and David, as of yet, have plausible deniability. So anyway, so I'm a sociologist of culture, and I think one of the really exciting things for me is the changes that have made it possible, I think, to put sociology of culture on a kind of more scientific basis. Part of it is work in social cognition that gives us a much better grounding for understand how culture enters into everyday life and into social interaction. But the other thing are the new text analysis tools, which are now available. So far, most of the research on culture using text analysis tools has focused on the macro or mezzo level. It's been based on aggregating data into chunks and looking at how the character of those chunks has changed over time. So, for example, looking at the emergence of I'm trying to get the little glowing thing to work, but it doesn't seem to want to cooperate. Oh dear. Okay. Looking at the emergence of themes over time in a policy arena, or looking at changes in stereotypes of ethnic and racial groups in the United States over 100 years. What it hasn't really done yet, and what we're trying to think about how to do, is to take advantage of the fact that in a lot of language use, the sequence in which things happen really matters. And if you can attend to sequence, if you have data on sequence, you can look at how they influence outcomes. You can examine transitions among terms or themes that give you insight into the sort of underlying structure of how a domain is constructed, and you can analyze language's strategic behavior. So that's what we're trying to do. And we're doing it using data from IBM, from a series of company-wide discussions that they've had on their intranet around kind of pressing issues that the company has faced over the past 20 years. They innovated with this, but it's spread to a lot of other corporations. So this has become a kind of major device that big companies use to try to reinforce their culture, get a sense of buy-in from employees, and integrate thinking across a multinational scope. So the context for the data that I'm talking about today, and both projects use the same data, is IBM in 2003 and 2004. IBM had had a near-death experience, as people there described it, in the early 1990s, where the company almost went out of business. They hired for the first time an outside CEO, a turnaround expert who had headed American Express, and he brought the company back to profitability by changing things very dramatically in terms of their business model. And he also had to fire, in doing that, he fired about 150, 200,000 or more people. And then the company recovered, and then they ended up hiring another 100,000 or so people or more towards the end of the 90s. So this company that had been the model for organizational or corporate culture when the Watson family ran it, 2 generations, using the sort of basic values is what they called it, abandoned its company culture, which they had seen as counterproductive, and then got rid of a lot of people who had been there a long time, brought in a lot of people who really didn't have a chance to be socialized. They were also spread all over the globe, and many of them actually worked from home. So they faced a kind of crisis of culture, and when they got a new CEO in 2002, one of the first things he did is said, okay, the old values became dysfunctional, but we need a new mission statement, a new set of underlying account or story about who we are. So they had 2 online discussions. In 2003, they had a discussion which they referred to as the Values Jam. They used the term jam to try to encourage an improvisatory, informal tone. Went on for 72 hours, and basically what it was for was to take a new set of values that management had created and get all of the people in the company who were interested to criticize it, to suggest changes, and on the basis of that discussion, they significantly revised the values statement. 2004, they took the new values statement, and for each of the new sort of central principles, they developed 2 kind of global challenges that they were dealing with and had discussions around those. Each of those was a forum. The 2004 Jam involved a lot more people, and this is what the interface looks like if you were in 2003 getting onto it. It was a lot less blurry than that. But there were 4 forums, and you could choose the one you wanted. If you were just dipping in, the moderator would identify particular threads that he thought were interesting. And then there were a couple of things which I can talk about, but didn't really go anywhere. The major features of the jam were that everybody had to register, so nothing was anonymous, and that's really important for any discussion of this kind. Second one was that the moderators didn't remove posts. And that was very controversial because the 2003 jam turned out to be an occasion for a lot of the old IBM employees who were really pissed off about the changes to Vent in a very angry manner, and they almost terminated the discussion. There was a big conversation among management and the communications department. They decided not to, and they also decided that if they continued it, they couldn't be taking down posts because they didn't like them. So that became a norm which has continued to this day. If people registered, they could read the postings. They didn't have to participate by writing. And the structure was provided by the forums. And one important thing is that people were really busy. They were still doing their jobs. And because of that, people dipped in and out of the conversation. It wasn't just sitting in front of a screen for 72 hours. It was the end of the day going into it and seeing what was going on and maybe participating. The jam structure, and we draw on Bakhtin's work on speech genres, and thinking about this, the utterance is the post. That's the basic unit of communication. It has a beginning and an end. And that structure enforces an orderly sequence of interventions. Unlike conversation where people can finish each other's sentences, they interrupt, they interject, and so on. In a jam, that doesn't happen. Forking is common. I may make a post, 2 of you might respond, and then each of those responses gets its own thread in response to that. And significantly, the utterances, compared to face-to-face conversation, the utterances are experienced visually and spatially. When we have a conversation, we experience it through our ears, and we experience it through as a sequence of speech acts. Very different online. It's through the eyes and space. Okay, I talked about inconsistent participation. The sort of theoretical inspiration for the first part of the thing I'm going to talk with you about comes from Randall Collins' theory of interaction ritual chains. Our research question is really simple. Given how hard it is to sustain an online discussion, what is it that predicts that a particular post will actually have somebody respond to it and keep the discussion going, or the thread going, for one more move? That's our dependent variable. Collins' theory is developed for face-to-face conversations. He was skeptical as to whether it would work online. And basically the idea is you have a shared focus of attention. When people focus on the same thing and care about it, they develop a kind of almost physical entrainment, a neurological alignment. They move together. There's a lot of research on face-to-face interaction that documents this. That leads to feelings of solidarity, shared identity, which leads to what he calls emotional energy. People feel more attractive and so on. And it produces a positive interaction that people want to continue and build from. So the independent variables, if you strip this down, are basically entrainment or excitation, the extent to which, in the case of an online discussion, a post contributes to an ongoing sense of energy and excitement about the conversation. Focus, the extent to which there's a common shared focus of the participants. And identity I'm not going to talk about because we don't exploit the sequential nature of the data for looking at identity. So we had, for excitation, we had to figure out, entrainment is all about really face-to-face engrossment and neurological alignment. What's the counterpart? Is there a kind of socially expected duration, a kind of rhythm in these online discussions? And we found that there was. And it turned out that there were periods in each jam that if you responded within a certain range, you were more likely to get a response. If you failed to do that, your chances of getting a response fell off sharply. So excitation is a measure summed across an exponentially decaying function of time from the last post, and then summed across several different posts. And so that the hypothesis is that the more quickly one responds to a post it's actually not exactly more quickly, but in general, the sooner one responds, the more likely one is to get a response oneself. Then the second thing we're looking at is focus, and whether focus is being sustained over time. And for focus, you need to have some typology of themes or subjects. We use a topic model for that. It's a simple LDA, plain vanilla model where each post is a text. There are 40,000 some posts, and we have a 30-topic solution that was selected after applications of the Mallet machine learning toolkit that David and his colleagues developed. And what we found was there was a stable structure across the two jams, different prevalence, but we were able to merge the data. And we interpreted the topics the way you always do, which is you look at the terms that emerge from the topic model and try to make some sense of them, and then you go back to the texts in which that topic was most strongly represented, and you do a lot of reading, and then you come up with an interpretation of the thing. So we have the measure that we're interested in here is one that looks at sustaining of focus over the course of the discussion. So it's a measure of the extent to which there's a mutuality of focus between a given post and the post to which it responded. To what extent does that post sustain the focus? We use 1 minus the Jensen-Shannon symmetric divergence measure between the distributions of the 30 topics across the two posts. And the hypothesis here is that the higher the continuity of topical focus between the parent post and the focal post, the more likely the focal post is to get a response. So what do we find with the first hypothesis, that excitation predicts persistence, strongly supported? The second hypothesis, that a focus between posts, sustaining a focus, predicts persistence, also strongly supported. So that's an example of how we built the kind of sequential character of our data into two measures for this particular study. Now, the second study that I want to talk about is one that is just at its very beginning stages. Essentially, all we have are some descriptive statistics. So I'm going to talk about what we plan to do. And what we're trying to do is figure out a vocabulary for talking about relational aspects of meaning, in a sense to ask whether people who study culture can get into meaning as more than just a kind of indexical expression that gestures at interpretation, which is basically how it's used in a lot of the literature now. There are two phases of meaning. One is meaning is emergent from a network of terms, or in schemas, emergent from a network of representations. So the meaning doesn't inhere in particular elements, but inheres in the relationship among them. And then there's an element of what I call good enough intersubjectivity, and that schemas have to be aligned to the extent that people can sort of understand each other or pretend that they do. So the first step, and we're looking here at the semantic, well, not exactly the semantic networks, but at relationships among topics in the topic model, with the relationship being that a particular intervention in the discussion represents a particular topic to a high degree, in the sequence of topics that are represented in posts that follow one another. Does that make sense? Okay, it's early, so. And where we are now is basically just trying to come up with a few descriptive dimensions that can be used to characterize the state of a particular data set. So one dimension has to do with some topics being attractive and others being unattractive. And by attractive, I mean that when you put them in the context of the study that I just told you about, when you put them into the regression model, posts that deal with a particular subject matter are more likely to get a response. People are excited about the subject matter, and ones that don't are less likely to get a response. So attractive topics at IBM included discussions of work-life balance, controlling for everything else. They were more likely to get responses. People talking about the good old days at IBM, particularly the older employees, they liked to talk about that. People responded to that. And it turned out anything that sort of expressed positive feelings, like, boy, that was a great statement, what a useful thing this is, we're likely to get responses. The one unattractive topic, the one thing which kind of shut off discussion, were specific conversations about the old IBM values, because they had been discarded, so that wasn't something that elicited a lot of interest. Now, the rest of the measures really come out of this matrix, which is a transition matrix. This is the topic that's represented strongly in the parent post, the one to which the focal post is responding. This is the topic, the columns, that's represented in the child post. And these are exponentiated coefficients that represent transition probabilities. The second dimension has to do with the diagonal. And the question is, to what there's some topics that are Velcro and there's some topics that are Teflon. And by a Velcro topic, I mean a topic where the diagonal figure tends to be quite strong, quite high. And by Teflon, I mean one where the diagonal is weak and not significant, okay? So Velcro topics included basically things that had to do with the career prospects of the employee at IBM. Work-life balance, being able to get training, finding mentorship, and performance evaluation, things that really matter to people in terms of their own career. Teflon topics actually included two that were quite important to the company as a whole, but weren't as important for the individual employees' welfare, and had to do with tools that people could use in project delivery, which was very central to the mission and some of the issues they were dealing with, but apparently less attractive to the employees. The third dimension has to do with what I call segues versus strategies, and that deals with the off-diagonal cells in the transition matrix. Segue is a kind of transition that's above what you would expect, but is kind of organic between two topics that are thematically related. So for example, discussions about consulting services tend to transition into discussions about particular ways of providing solutions to customers, and that's a natural progression. That makes sense. Discussions of risk control tend to seg into discussions about tools that are used, information tools that can be used to assess risk and things like that. There were also things that I think, hypothetically at least, are more strategic transitions, and these are things we want to do some, intense reading of the posts about. But when posts that had to do with the good old days and waxed romantic and nostalgic and sort of angry at the new management were often countered with posts that emphasized career development opportunities and learning opportunities for employees. Ones that talked about the old values were often met with posts that talked about IBM's culture and trust within the organization. So at least the hypothesis is that these were strategic interventions of people who were trying to change the subject. Then finally, sort of an homage to James March, the founder of the garbage can theory of decision making. We're looking for intrusive topics, which we think can provide clues about preoccupations of people in the system. What are people thinking about to the degree that these topics or themes tend to intrude on discussions about other things? And I'm not going to read through all of them, but there are two kinds. One kind are issues that really are important issues for the company, and you can sort of understand how people would be worrying about them. The other are things that just make people mad, and they probably are chronically annoyed about them, and they keep talking about them in many contexts. So an example of that would be discussions of meetings. Everybody says there are too many meetings. Why do we have so many meetings? Nobody in academia could relate to that, but Another one was budgets and planning. It turns out the way in which they did budgeting made it hard to do a bunch of things that you would want to do to make the relationship with clients work better. So anyway, let me stop there and look forward to comments, questions, interjections. What an ethno-methodological moment that was. Yeah.
So when you do topic modeling, it's pooled data, right? So the sequences all enter all at the same time. So are there new kind of developments in this field where you could see the evolution of the topics themselves over time?
Well, so we did a little bit of that in the paper that I showed before, and David, you probably know about things that I don't know about yet, but in one of the papers on where I showed the slide at the very beginning, we looked at topic emergence as basically by the hypothesis there is that you can say that a topic has emerged and is a real topic, if you will, when from one period to the next there's a fair amount of stability in the terms. So you can take any kind of divergence measure, and when that divergence measure drops sharply, that's an indication that a topic has solidified and the topic emergences. So there's that kind of thing. What we're doing here is taking the topic, which of course comes out of all of these interactions among people, and looking at the way in which it is either present or not present, depending on the sequence of interactions that we're looking at, which is a little bit different. David, is there a new magic bullet that will help with this? No? Oh, damn. Yeah, Matt.
So I like how you have this sort of internal replication. You have the same process happening with a slightly different topic.
Yeah.
It looked like very quickly from what I saw, they were quite similar in their results in terms of the hypotheses you had. Were there any differences between the two?
between the two,
The world
the
jam
two
and the
discussions.
value jam, yeah.
There, so I think I was talking with Clark yesterday, and I think probably as we go on, we're going to actually do separate topic models for the two, and because although I think statistically it makes sense to merge the data, I have a feeling we're not seeing some interesting stuff that we will see when we do separate models. In fact, some of the work we've done since then, we have used separate models. But yeah, there were different results for the two jams in terms of particular topic transitions. There were some similar ones and some that were diverged. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question. Well, that was very interesting. Thank you for the presentation. But I have a question about, which is probably not directly related to any of the two projects, but when you talked about meaning and the possibility we have now to try to capture meaning as a relational structure, you mentioned semantic networks. Have you tried to compare how semantic networks would allow you to illuminate meaning with topic models, and whether they would give you similar, because both are relational for different reasons.
Yeah.
And you would analyze those data structures differently.
Yeah.
So have you done that?
No, I haven't, and that's actually something I really want to do. I think we actually have data from a third one of these jams, which has some real advantages because we can actually, I think, begin to look at networks, or at least sort of intent to treat kind of networks. For these we have the grossest. It turns out that IBM, at least in 2003 and 2004, had about as many job titles as it had employees, and nobody could remember what they meant. So we were able to classify people grossly, but not finally. 2009 data, I think we'll be able to figure out who might have been working with whom and so on. And one of the things that I'm looking forward to doing is using some, looking at word embeddings versus topic models and seeing if the two can. My sense is that one of the things which would be really interesting to do would be to take texts in which different kinds of topics are prominent and look at the differences in word embeddings in those two kinds of things. I've done a little bit of that in simply the old-fashioned way by looking at texts that are related to particular different topics. This was in a policy analysis project. And it turns out that the same word when used in text where different topics are prevalent has very different associated words, different meanings. And I think word embeddings could bring that out in a really interesting way. Yeah.
So instead of having this purely inductive approach where topics emerge from data, what would you think about having a portion of the text coded by human coders, and then the rest of the data is parsed out accordingly? So what would be lost at that?
A lot of people are doing that, but I gotta say my major bone to pick with computer scientists who I otherwise love, and David, I don't know if you agree or disagree on that. We've talked a little bit about it, but you're not too strong. At least I don't think you're as extreme on this as some people. Computer scientists will sometimes say, well, we really want ground truth data. Well, what's ground truth data? It's based on human judgment. What have we learned from the last 50 years of professional cognitive and social psychology? Human judgment sucks, I mean, I would rather trust a topic model than my own coding most of the time with most data. So, I don't mean to be so, but I really think that we have to figure out, if we're going to have a gold standard to which we compare the results, if we had that, it would be great to be able to see the topic models with it. But if we don't have it, if we use flawed data, then. But
just considering getting irony and things like that, the discussions around where something is said in a sentence.
Irony is really hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
yeah. I don't know. David, have they made any progress on irony?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
That's what I thought.
Sarcasm. Can you tell the difference?
Well.
You have more time.
Do I have more time? Oh, okay.
Yes, like 5 minutes.
Yeah,
Very
Barney.
general question, and you can decide. There might be different ways to answer this, but it seems that there might be an opening here to move from looking at data in a more static view to a more dynamic view. This presents one handle to do that. I'm just thinking sort of more broadly as it pertains to the future of the social sciences, how data sets and actually order of data might play out given the types of data that we have now that we may not have had 10 years ago or so. Just any speculations on that? Or ideas?
Well, I think no, just that we're likely to get more data of that kind. I mean, certainly we have a lot of textual data in which one intervention follows directly upon another intervention in response to that. You know, a lot of social media data has that character. I would love to see more use of data, say, from focus groups or natural discussions, where you know, can actually look at the sequence in which people speak. And but as you know, and what I've talked about today is sort of a very first effort to begin to think about ways of looking at that. But it's clearly an important frontier. And
I guess like the tools would be one. You know, I remember years ago I tried to do analysis of it. It's very difficult. Time series data is just difficult to handle.
Yeah.
And the tools, you think the tools are going to see a lot of jump in the types of tools that are developed?
I'm sure, yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is where I think collaborations with folks in computer science are so valuable, because they're you know, they can do 10 tools in the time that the typical sociologist could come up with one. And you know, I think the challenge for sociologists is to collaborate with computer scientists and to find ways of tailoring the tools to the particular research questions that we have, and also to continue training our students. And a lot of people in this room are doing that to make them literate in those tools. And I've been impressed at how graduate students in sociology are going out and finding what they need to know. But you know, but there's a lot more to do, particularly if the tools themselves are evolving quickly, which I think they will. Yeah.
Yes, a few years ago I worked with these same data from IBM.
Really?
Yes, and we found very strong demographic and cultural homophily in the exchanges. Did you control for that?
Yeah, and at least in well, have we? I'm trying to think. How we've looked at that? In the first study I talked about, we weren't really looking at homophily. We certainly controlled for gender and position in the company in terms of whether it affected people getting a response, and it actually didn't have much of an effect. Of course, what we don't know is the self-selection, differential self-selection by gender or position in the company. In another study, which I haven't talked about, where we are trying to sort of reverse engineer the process in the World Jam by which a set of management committees selected particular posts to represent ideas that they would then invest in. Or it was actually a longer process than that. And they came up with a bunch of ideas they thought were good ideas. They came up with posts to illustrate them. They then had another part of the discussion where they voted on the different posts that were finalists and so on. In trying to reverse engineer that process, one of the things we looked at were the extent to which communication styles, the sharing of communication styles, as well as the sharing of topical themes between people, was associated with success. And in the course of doing that, we found that there was there was strong differentiation in style of expression between executives on the one hand and managers and everybody else on the other, and that people who express themselves in a manner similar to managers and also similar to people in the U.S. if they were from abroad, were more likely to have their contributions highlighted than people who didn't. Does that ring any bells or resonate with what you found?
A little bit, because we did also find cultural homophily, not just geographic. I mean, or at least the demographic dimensions that are sort of more on the cultural end of things.
Like where
language, religion.
Yeah, yeah. So you had religion?
Well, we had religion of, we had, because it's global, we had the dominant religions.
Oh,
of the
okay.
country,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, region definitely.
We were actually
definitely matters.
testing, we were doing something that, we were testing Huntington's theory of the classes of religion.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah. But probably IBM weeds out the sort of major people at the ends of that clash.
I mean, they're all there because it's such a big company and all
Yeah.
over the world, so there was definitely.
Yeah, yeah. Very interesting. Do you have a paper on that?
Yeah, it's published somewhere.
Okay, if you could send me
Yeah.
the reference, I would love to see it. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I have a different question, a different version of Philip's question about having humans coding. And it's slightly more about like accumulation of science. So let's say you write this up with your coders, becomes like big article. Many people start doing something similar, using similar methodology on similar data sets, confirm some of the topics, others come out slightly different.
Mm-hmm.
At some point, would you expect them to be slightly less inferential and more deductive
Mm-hmm.
in terms of like, we have established that some topics are common across the board, or would you always suggest 10 years down the road to just like go with machine learning, look at what comes out and then interpret it?
Well, so the first half, we tried to be really deductive. So I think you're talking about the second half. And there, you've basically seen everything we have, and we're basically talking about how to measure it properly. So what I showed you today is a kind of attempt to conceptually differentiate different kinds of relations amongst topics or themes in a discussion, but we haven't gotten to the measurement yet, and once we do, I would hope that we could be more deductive. I don't think we'd necessarily generalize across discussions, because every discussion has its own dynamic, and it would be surprising to find any two discussions where the topic model generated the exact same things. But I think there are ways of looking at textual data where you could look across different discussions in more comparative ways, and that's one of the things that we're talking about doing. Yeah. Okay, thank you.